Saturday, April 1st, 1995, was a chilly, overcast spring morning in Everett, Washington. Gail Doll-Iffrig had just been woken up by her 8-year-old son Nicholas, who had some alarming news. He couldn't find his sister, 7-year-old Roxanne. It was about 8:30 a.m. and 5-year-old Christina was accounted for, but Roxanne was nowhere to be seen. However, the pink nightgown that Roxanne had gone to sleep in the night before was still in the bedroom that she shared with her younger sister. Gail Doll-Iffrig searched the family's modest single-story home, and she went to the homes of neighbors as well. She then spent the morning on the phone calling friends and relatives in the area. There was no sign of Roxanne, and nobody had seen the bubbly little blonde-haired 7-year-old. At 12:30, Gail Doll-Iffrig, who was worried sick at this point, called police to report her little girl missing. My name is Michael, and this is the story of Roxanne Doll, a sweet little girl who one day just vanished. And this story also brings with it controversy concerning her parents. Keep watching and you'll understand why, but I want to stress, this is about telling Roxanne's story, not vilifying her mom and dad. Please be warned that this crime does involve the R word and extreme violence against the victim. Also, I want to say a big thanks to Old World Love, who brought Roxanne's story to my attention. Suggestions are always welcome. As always, the full newspaper article from my thumbnail is available at grimsilence.com, and if you're interested in true crime that tends to be older and more obscure, please be sure to like, subscribe, and comment below. Everett, Washington, located about half an hour's drive north of Seattle, is known for its world-class marina and for being the home of Boeing's largest aircraft factory. And in 1995, this bustling suburban city was the home of Roxanne Doll, a cheerful, talkative 7-year-old girl. Gail Doll-Iffrig once described Roxanne as an easygoing girl who knew what she wanted, which was to be a mommy and have 12 children. She loved caring for her infant cousins, and the girl's mothering instincts also extended to the family's cats, who very graciously allowed Roxanne to wrap them up in doll clothes and play with them in a stroller. According to her classmate Melissa Greenman, Roxanne liked to talk a lot. She loved singing, especially Disney songs. She always chose to wear dresses instead of pants, and she crossed her legs like she saw movie stars do. And she hated writing in cursive. Roxanne was a happy, lively little girl who had just learned to ride her bike a month earlier. She was adored by her family and those who knew her, which made her disappearance that much harder to bear. On the night that Roxanne Doll went missing, 28-year-old Tim Iffrig, Roxanne's father, was, according to news reports, at a neighbor's house visiting friends. Roxanne's mother, 29-year-old Gail Doll-Iffrig, who was headed out to see a movie with a girlfriend, dropped in at the neighbor's house to give Tim Iffrig, her husband, the house key before leaving, and then Iffrig was reported to have returned home soon after his wife had left. Elliot Woodall, a police spokesman, publicly announced that there were no adults in the house for, quote, a very brief time, a matter of minutes. These were the basic facts, which all sounded pretty mundane. Mom went out, handed Dad the key, Dad went home. But it didn't take long for police to announce that they were taking a good long look at a friend of the Doll-Iffrig family. And with that, the seeds of controversy were sown as new details of that night emerged. Authorities looked very closely at the night Roxanne Doll vanished. It turned out that one of the friends Iffrig was with that night had a conviction on his record that involved a 4-year-old girl. More on that later. This friend had also submitted to a polygraph test, as had the family and many others, and the test indicated deception when Tim Iffrig's friend was asked about Roxanne's whereabouts. However, as no charges had yet been filed, this friend remained unidentified in the news media. Also notable was that police had searched this friend's vehicle, which was, predictably, an old, nondescript van, the preferred vehicle of predators everywhere. Before his wife had tucked in the kids and come to give him the house key, Tim Iffrig and his friends, one of them being the unnamed suspect, were reportedly, quote, drinking large quantities of alcohol, and court testimony would later reveal that illegal substances were also being consumed. Newspaper reports also stated that Iffrig arrived home and, again quoting, passed out on the sofa. These are not my words. This is the language that was used in both newspapers and court testimony. The public at the time was not aware of the substance abuse, so many came to believe that Tim Iffrig was passed out drunk, an accusation that he would later deny. But if he was passed out drunk, as some put it, that could have easily caused him to sleep through just about anything, including the abduction of one of his children. Make no mistake, police had their attention focused entirely on finding the little girl, but the fact that Tim Iffrig was asleep in his living room after a night of booze and substances certainly raised eyebrows. These facts figured heavily into law enforcement's theories on how Roxanne went missing, and Roxanne Doll's mother and father began to attract criticism, not from the police, but from local citizens. This case was in the news for quite some time, and the criticism would begin to grow, prompting Roxanne's mother to make a public statement that really got people riled up, which I will share in a bit. Getting back to the events of that fateful night, Gail Doll-Iffrig returned home at about midnight, and the door had been left unlocked, perhaps intentionally since she had given her key to her husband. But court testimony would later reveal that the mother walked in to find the house filled with smoke. Her husband had apparently begun preparing food on the stove about 2 hours earlier before taking his siesta on the couch, and the food was burning on the stove when his wife came home. Doll-Iffrig woke up her husband, turned off the stove, and then checked on the children. 7-year-old Roxanne and 5-year-old Christina shared bunk beds in their room, and the mother initially reported seeing the two girls asleep together on the bottom bunk. In early reporting, Doll-Iffrig was quoted as saying, "I saw both of their little heads in bed," although the police would later suggest that she might not have seen both of her daughters, as the mother had only briefly turned on the light for a quick glance. And soon afterward, Gail Doll-Iffrig herself would begin to have doubts about whether she had seen both girls sleeping that night. The next day, after notifying police that her daughter was missing, the mother prayed Roxanne was with Tim Iffrig, who had left the house earlier that morning to go camping with his friend Richard Clark, one of the same people he had been partying with at the neighbor's house the night before. Clark had also gone to the Doll-Iffrig house that night at about 1 a.m. after the mother had returned home, and before long, Iffrig and Clark went back to the neighbor's house to indulge in more alcohol and illegal substances. In the course of calling around on Saturday morning to try and track down her daughter, Gail Doll-Iffrig's sister-in-law said that she had seen Tim Iffrig and Richard Clark on their way to the campsite, and that Roxanne was not with them. But Roxanne's mother, who was growing increasingly worried, needed to see for herself. She drove to the area near Granite Falls where her husband and Richard Clark were camping, only to find the two men and no Roxanne. This was the first that Tim Iffrig was hearing of his daughter's disappearance. Investigators paid a visit to the family's house. There was no sign of a struggle inside the Doll-Iffrig house, and nobody had reported hearing any barking from Bear, the family's dog. Bear was a pit bull Rottweiler mix, and although he was probably a very good boy, that type of dog was certainly capable of making a lot of noise if he wanted to. And as the police always do in these cases, they interviewed the family. According to the book Broken Doll, an account of Roxanne's case by true crime author Burl Barer, Gail Doll-Iffrig's police interview was long and fairly contentious. She had been out at a movie, gone for 3 hours, and police treated her as though she were already a suspect, as if she must have kidnapped Roxanne and had somehow hidden her away with relatives, or maybe even disposed of her body. They were most likely just trying to rattle her because you never know, but Doll-Iffrig was none too pleased about it. Police also interviewed Roxanne's siblings, asking 5-year-old Christina questions like, "What happens when you play house with your dad?" And "What is the one thing you don't want your dad to do?" Police were clearly fishing for signs of mistreatment or abuse, but there were none. Based on the responses from the children, Tim Iffrig sounded like a pretty great dad despite whatever the newspapers were printing about him. The family was quickly crossed off the list of potential suspects. As police continued to look for clues, the first of several search operations was quickly launched. Search and rescue teams used machetes to cut through the dense underbrush of a wooded area near the Doll-Iffrig home. Helicopters looked for signs of the girl from above. Search dogs were dispatched after being given Roxanne's scent from the nightgown she had worn the night before. Meanwhile, the Doll-Iffrig family printed flyers with Roxanne's picture on them, pleading for information that would lead them to their missing girl. Volunteers handed the flyers to pedestrians. The flyers were displayed in car windows, and they were posted everywhere around town. The search effort was tremendous, but there was no sign of Roxanne anywhere. By Monday, 2 full days after the girl was discovered missing, police announced that the ground search was ending, but efforts would soon resume in the days that followed. As days passed with no clues as to the whereabouts of their little girl, despair began to set in for Gail Doll-Iffrig and her husband Tim. Within a few days after Roxanne's disappearance, Doll-Iffrig was quoted as saying, "I shut my eyes and I see my daughter somewhere in a ditch." Tim Iffrig had a more detailed theory. He told reporters, "I think somebody came in her bedroom while she was sleeping, changed her clothes, packed her up, and took her out of here. I think they did it all, and she never woke up." Friends and relatives began wearing purple ribbons decorated with glitter and secured by an angel pin. They were made by second grader Melissa Greenman, Roxanne's classmate. Gail Doll-Iffrig said of this sweet gesture, "When Roxanne gets back, she'll get all the angel pins, so she'll have a whole choir of angels." 8-year-old Melissa said she wished she could go into the woods and help to look for her friend. Very early on, police began to suspect that Roxanne Doll had been abducted by someone she knew, someone known to the family, someone the family trusted. Roxanne's story dominated news coverage, and within a few days of the girl's disappearance, a crew from the TV show America's Most Wanted was at the Doll-Iffrig house to film a segment about her. This was quickly growing into a high-profile case that drew national attention, and police warned the family that they needed to prepare for the possibility that foul play might be involved. It was not lost on the family that every tick of the clock made it less likely that Roxanne would come home alive. The police widened their investigation and continued launching searches of nearby areas, but sadly, they determined that Roxanne Doll was unlikely to still be alive. It was April 7th, and Roxanne had been missing for nearly a week. They were looking for her body. It was also on April 7th that Everett police detective Lloyd Herndon received a phone call from Jimmy Miller, one of at least 2 half-brothers related to Richard Clark, the man Tim Iffrig had gone camping with on the morning that Roxanne was discovered missing. Richard Clark had also been partying at the neighbor's house with Iffrig the night before. And yes, Richard Clark was the unnamed suspect whose van had been searched by police, the suspect whose criminal history included a 4-year-old girl. Richard Clark was the suspect the police were unable to arrest just yet, but that changed when Jimmy Miller called and spoke with Detective Herndon. According to Miller, Richard Clark had made a request of another half-brother, Elza Clark. Richard Clark had told Elza that authorities had found blood in his van, and if the police were to ask, Elza was to say that the blood was from a poached deer. In fact, Clark had requested this of Elza twice, once on the phone and again in person, and Elza, apparently being annoyed by this badgering, told Jimmy Miller about it. Richard Clark, who was clearly not the sharpest knife in the drawer, apparently had no idea how useless this lie would be, as the FBI was already working on analyzing blood evidence from his van. It was becoming obvious that Clark felt the walls closing in, and he was becoming desperate. Elza Clark made the very intelligent decision to refuse to lie for his half-brother. And after Detective Herndon ended his call with Jimmy Miller, police went to the home of Elza Clark to confirm Jimmy Miller's story. Richard Clark, who was already under 24-hour police surveillance after his deceptive polygraph results, was then immediately arrested on the charge of witness tampering. Bail was set at $100,000. With Richard Clark in custody and FBI lab results on the way, the search for Roxanne continued. When county officials announced plans for the most intensive search yet, over 200 trained volunteers arrived from near and far within hours. Every search team in Snohomish County showed up. More came from nearby military bases and counties all around the area. There were so many volunteers that the Red Cross made arrangements to feed everyone. By Saturday, April 8th, a full week after Roxanne Doll had been reported missing, the search party had grown to over 350, many of whom were police officers and firefighters. The search for Roxanne Doll had become the largest in the county's history. The search went on for 12 hours and yielded nothing. And then a discovery was made, not by any of the hundreds of professionals who had volunteered, but by two young girls, ages 9 and 10, who quite accidentally stumbled upon a horrifying discovery that would leave both severely traumatized. It was about 7:30 p.m., and the girls were trying to retrieve a toy that had tumbled down an embankment in a residential area. What they found instead was a small child's foot. It was sticking out from under a pile of debris and yard waste. The girls instantly started crying and screaming. A couple of boys who lived nearby heard the girls' cries and went to investigate. Upon seeing the foot, they ran and alerted their dad, who called police. This all took place in North Everett, miles away from where searches had been performed. The area was immediately cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape. Because night was falling and police feared the possibility that evidence might get damaged, it was decided to wait until morning before uncovering what they all suspected was the body of Roxanne Doll. At daybreak the next morning, investigators spent 7 hours unearthing the child's remains and combing the surrounding area for clues left by the perpetrator. Among those clues was an identification bracelet bearing Roxanne's name. The Snohomish County medical examiner made a preliminary identification that the body was that of Roxanne Doll, and an autopsy later confirmed it. As one can imagine, the family was devastated. Roxanne's older sister, 11-year-old Jennifer, wailed as reporters surrounded her and her mother. "I'm really going to miss the way she bugged me," the girl said in between sobs. Gail Doll-Iffrig tearfully conceded that her family was moving on to a new stage of their lives, one that didn't include their beloved Roxanne. And with the burden of not knowing finally lifted, she added, "We now know where she is. She's up in heaven." On Monday, April 10th, Richard Clark, who was already in custody for witness tampering, was arrested yet again and booked on suspicion of murder. This time, bail was set at $1 million. And with this latest development, details about Clark's past began to emerge. Scott North of the Daily Herald called Clark a drug abuser, a drunk, a bad driver, and a car thief. Of course, there are many others with much worse rap sheets, but one past offense in particular is missing from this list. Richard Matthew Clark had also committed a serious crime against a 4-year-old girl about 7 years earlier. Clark had locked himself and the girl inside his grandfather's garage. He tied the girl's hands behind her back with a sock, and the girl's mother could hear her cries from outside the structure. The girl had initially told investigators that Clark had touched her, but she later said she couldn't remember or didn't know what had happened. Charges were reduced to unlawful imprisonment, and Clark was sentenced to just 1 year behind bars. Richard Clark's early years checked many of the same boxes as others who have committed the worst crimes imaginable. Cruel and abusive parents, dropping out of school, a long history of drug and alcohol abuse, and battles with depression were among many factors that drove Clark down a dark path. And yes, these are all very serious issues, but as the prosecution would later observe, there were 4 other children in the Clark household who were subjected to the very same abuse, neglect, and trauma. But Richard Clark was the only one who grew up to commit unspeakable crimes against a 7-year-old girl. Police began collecting evidence from Clark's home, and the community shifted from clinging to hope to grieving for the loss of Roxanne Doll. Mourners erected a makeshift memorial at the site where Roxanne's body was found. The Daily Herald published a touching opinion piece. Readers expressed their sorrow in letters to the editor, and an artist took the time to draw Roxanne's portrait, which the paper published. Tim Iffrig and his brother, Bill D. Alexander, memorialized Roxanne by tattooing her picture on their chests. At Roxanne's elementary school, the school principal said that the girl's desk would remain where she had left it more than a week earlier. And with deep sadness, the principal said, "She's still a part of the class." Over the next several days, some very disturbing details of the murder of Roxanne Doll would come to light, and what you are about to hear may be upsetting. When investigators went through the contents of Richard Clark's filthy van, which was just a few days after Roxanne went missing, they removed potential evidence that included hair, a mattress, blankets, clothing, and for reasons we probably don't want to know, fecal matter. And of course, there was the blood that Clark was so desperate to claim had come from a poached but fictional deer. Some of the blood was on a sleeping bag, and it was also found on a sock. The sock was reminiscent of Clark's earlier conviction involving that 4-year-old girl. It's worth pointing out, by the way, that Roxanne's parents had no knowledge of this conviction. They knew that Clark had petty burglary and other less serious crimes in his past, but they believed that that was the extent of it. Clark's unlawful imprisonment conviction was one of the main reasons that authorities were searching Clark's van so soon after Roxanne's disappearance. And with the discovery of Roxanne's body, authorities were finally able to start piecing everything together. Forensic evidence included fibers on Roxanne's body that matched the carpet fibers in Clark's van. Reporting did not state whether those fibers were trilobal. The blood in Clark's van was, without question, Roxanne's, and bodily fluids taken from Roxanne's body had come from Richard Clark, proving that he had indeed R-worded the girl on the night that he stole her away from her home. Police had initially refused to even entertain questions on this topic, but it was confirmed. Court documents would later reveal ugly details that I will not share here, but lacerations caused by this assault alone could have resulted in fatal blood loss. But 7-year-old Roxanne had also been stabbed in the neck multiple times, possibly with a pocket knife. Her left jugular was severed. It was impossible to tell which had occurred first, the stabbing or the assault, but the two combined amounted to aggravated first-degree murder, the only crime in the state of Washington that could make Richard Clark eligible for the death penalty. At some point, while Gail Doll-Iffrig was planning her daughter's funeral, her sorrow turned, quite understandably, into rage. Details of the murder were still trickling out of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, and Richard Clark had not yet been put on trial. But Roxanne's mother knew in her heart that he was the one who had taken her baby from her. With talk of execution already making headlines, Gail Doll-Iffrig said very publicly that she opposed the death penalty for him because it was too quick. She wanted him to suffer for the rest of his life, just as she would have to forever suffer with the knowledge of what Clark had done to her sweet angel. With her worst fears realized and nothing left to lose, Gail Doll-Iffrig had something else to say, not to Richard Clark, but to the critics and finger-pointers who had seized on the widely publicized reports that Tim Iffrig had passed out after drinking. I don't know if she had just heard upsetting whispers or if people were brazenly walking up to her and blaming her for her daughter's death. My guess is probably both. But Roxanne was dead, and the girl's mother had had enough. She said, quote, "Those people out there who believe my husband and I are partially to blame for my daughter's disappearance and murder, those people can go to hell." And that really stirred the pot of controversy that had been quietly simmering since the reports of passed-out dad had first surfaced. Over a period of several weeks, local newspapers published a number of angry responses to Gail Doll-Iffrig's comments. Here's what some of them shot back with. B.G. Olson wrote, "I, as well as everyone I have spoken with, can't understand why Roxanne's parents feel no responsibility in what happened to their daughter. I don't know anyone that would leave their children in the care of an adult, father or not, that was going to be drinking heavily." Rose A. Mansfield had this to say, "Are you protecting and watching your children by partying at the neighbors, drinking and then passing out on the couch? Was this a responsible parent of sound mind and body, protecting his children? The answer is flatly no." W.K. Testerman, who I'm going to paraphrase just a little bit, added, "Roxanne's parents' attitude is another sign of a sick society. Perhaps someone should tell them that being a parent means something more than giving birth to a child." And finally, Donna Clausen. "I wonder why this precious child was not better supervised by her parents. I wonder why her father put his drinking before the welfare of this child. I wonder how a mother can leave her child with a man who put himself and his drinking before his responsibility to this child." Some will nod in agreement with the comments of these 4 Everett residents. Others will shake their heads in disgust. One thing we can all agree on, however, is that it is highly unlikely that any of these 4 people had a daughter who was murdered, R-worded, and buried in a pile of waste, which is obviously thanks to their flawless parenting and unimpeachable character. Note the sarcasm. Donna Clausen's words, however, were printed alongside a very compassionate letter that supported the Doll-Iffrig family. Kathy Savaleski of Monroe, a neighboring town, blamed nobody but the killer and praised Roxanne's mother for her courage. Other letters of support were published as well. While many agreed that the entire Doll-Iffrig family had been courageous throughout the whole ordeal, the ordeal was far from over. There was still the matter of burying little Roxanne, and there was the so-called family friend awaiting his murder trial. Roxanne Doll's funeral was held on Saturday, April 15th, exactly 2 weeks after she was discovered missing from her home, and about 1 week before she would have celebrated her 8th birthday. On that morning, sunshine broke through the clouds as a group of mourners decked out their motorcycles with pink ribbons, which Roxanne would have loved. They rode all around Everett, Washington, and everyone who encountered the loud, rumbling parade of pink ribbons knew exactly who they were for. The ride was organized as a special way of honoring the girl's memory, ending at the Doll-Iffrig home. That afternoon, over 500 attended the little girl's funeral. Many knew Roxanne. Some had searched for her. Most had never met the girl, but her story had affected the community deeply. Roxanne's heartbreakingly small casket was pure white with silver trim, and it was surrounded by a vast array of fresh flowers and a photo of the bright-eyed, cheerful little girl she would forever be remembered as. Mourners filed past Roxanne's casket, leaving cards, flowers, and teddy bears as they wished her peace and said their final goodbyes. It was a day of tears, memories, and most importantly, an enormous outpouring of love for the precious girl who dreamed of being a mommy one day. With Roxanne Doll laid to rest, the spotlight shifted to Richard Clark, the monster who had taken the girl's life in such a cruel and brutal manner. It is said that the wheels of justice turn slowly, and that was most certainly the case with Clark. There were multiple pretrial hearings and delays, and one of those hearings revealed an interesting attempt at trickery on the part of investigators. It took place when Clark was being questioned but had not been arrested yet. An FBI agent walked into the interview room and said he was an attorney and that he was there to act as Clark's legal counsel. The agent then advised Clark to tell police everything he knew about the disappearance of Roxanne Doll. Clark refused, and the agent left the room. This attempt at tricking Clark into talking was done very early in the investigation. Again, Clark had not been arrested yet, and authorities believed at the time that Roxanne might still be alive. Jim Townsend, the county prosecutor, gave this highly questionable information-gathering tactic his blessing, and he did so with a singular goal in mind: bringing Roxanne home alive. The ruse failed, but Townsend had no regrets. Under the circumstances, he felt it was worth the risk. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Clark was steadfast in maintaining that he was innocent, pleading as such during his arraignment. Richard Matthew Clark's trial finally got underway in March of 1997, nearly 2 years after Roxanne had gone missing. Some newspaper reports stated that the prosecution had plans to call upwards of 100 witnesses. Some said it was 600. Regardless, many speculated that it would take months to reach a verdict. Members of Clark's own family were called to testify against him. Elza Clark repeated his story of how Richard Clark had tried to get him to lie for him about the blood. Clark had also apparently asked Elza to lie about being asked to lie. Toni Clark, Richard Clark's stepmother, recalled a phone conversation she had with the killer after his arrest. According to the book Broken Doll, the conversation went like this: "Did you kill that girl?" "No, I didn't do it. I don't know who did." "Did you rape her?" "I don't know." "Did you kidnap her?" "I don't think so." "What do you mean you don't think so? Either you did or you didn't." "Well, I don't remember everything that night." Tony Clark asked why, and Clark cited his alcohol and substance use that night as the cause of his failing memory, the same memory that was sharp enough to know that he needed to explain away the blood in his van. Despite initial fears that the trial would drag on endlessly, it was over after 32 days. There was no way that Clark would be found innocent, and he knew it. After 5 hours of deliberation, the guilty verdict was delivered to an emotionless Clark. Before his sentencing hearing, perhaps knowing what was coming next, Clark had the nerve to issue this outrageous statement. Quote, "I have sympathy for the 7-year-old girl, what had happened to her, but for the Iffrig family, they're the murderers." The wording here is significant. What had happened to her? In grammar, this is known as the passive voice, as if Richard Clark himself hadn't actively committed those heinous acts against Roxanne Doll. And his statement about the family being murderers quite clearly shows what he believed would be his sentence. And he was right. Deliberations at the sentencing hearing took only 2 hours. Richard Clark was to die for his crimes, but his story was far from over. Roxanne's mother, who had said in 1995 that she was against executing Clark, had had a change of heart. She and the rest of the family were very pleased with the verdict. Unfortunately, the sentence handed down in 1997 would not be carried out. Years would pass as appeals were filed, and in 2001, Clark was granted a new sentencing hearing. Jurors had apparently heard too many details about the 4-year-old girl Clark had tied up in that garage. Tim Iffrig was at work when he got the news. He had to excuse himself, to go behind the building to cry. By 2005, a full decade after Roxanne Doll had died at the hands of a monster, Richard Clark had still not been resentenced. New motions were filed, and the legal wrangling continued. By March 31, 2006, 11 years to the day since Clark had murdered and assaulted their beautiful girl, Roxanne's family finally got closure on their terms. Roxanne's younger sister, Christina, was 5 years old when it all happened. Jennifer was 11. And over the years, the two girls became increasingly haunted by the idea that maybe they could have done something. Maybe they could have saved their sister from her horrible end. Roxanne's parents, who were facing their own demons as well, saw how their 2 surviving daughters were suffering through the years of legal battles. As much as Roxanne's parents wanted to see the end of Clark's miserable life, what they wanted even more was to lift the unbearable burden of guilt that their daughters were carrying. And so, a deal was made. In return for life without parole instead of the electric chair, Richard Clark would answer questions from prosecutors and record a taped statement, which would later be shared with the family. Clark, who had never admitted guilt, would finally take full responsibility and confess to what he had done on the night that he took Roxanne. Clark wasn't getting away with murder in this deal. He was just postponing death, and the price he had to pay was giving the family closure. The family heard how Clark had coaxed Roxanne out of her bedroom window. He told the girl that he had a puppy in his van that she could play with. Roxanne had played with the puppy in Clark's van once before, so she trusted her father's friend and climbed out the window, never to return. It was all him. Nobody else was responsible, not Roxanne's parents, and certainly not Roxanne's young siblings. On the day that Roxanne's body was unearthed from its hiding place in North Everett, police found Roxanne's bracelet nearby. For 11 years, it had been held as evidence. After Richard Clark confessed and the hearing was over, prosecutors gave the bracelet back to the family. Roxanne's mother put it on her youngest daughter's wrist. Christina, now a teenager, and Jennifer, now a mother in her 20s, could finally rest easy knowing that it was not their fault. For Roxanne Doll's family, the nightmare had, at long last, come to an end. Sincere condolences to Roxanne's family and friends. Researching this case was heartbreaking, but I was happy to learn that despite all the criticism, Roxanne's mom and dad were actually doing great as parents. Roxanne and her siblings were happy, and they were loved, and the media didn't talk about that. Of course, I encourage you to leave your thoughts below in the comments, but please be respectful. There's a chance that Roxanne's family may someday see this video, and they don't need any hate. So, With that, thank you for watching.